There was no rhyme or reason for it. It was like a switch had flipped, changing Josh into someone else overnight. We were just kids, me, 9 years old, and Josh, freshly turned 11. It was probably our last year with babysitters, and I remember thinking how lucky we were that Friday night when our favorite babysitter, Teresa, showed up. Teresa always took us down to the corner store to pick a movie, and this night was no exception. Only a heavy thunderstorm loomed, lightning crackling and thunder rolling, the kind of storm that had our parents debating about even leaving, but they did. Teresa brought over a copy of Poltergeist, somehow rated PG, even though it scared the life out of me. I couldn't focus on the movie though, not when Josh seemed completely transfixed by the storm outside, staring through the window as if he could hear something under the booming thunder. Teresa put on The Lion King afterward to calm me down, but Josh just got up and went to bed. I eventually fell asleep on the couch with Teresa beside me, but the storm still raged when I woke up sometime later. Teresa walked me to my room, and as we passed Josh's, she peeked in and saw nothing but darkness. She shrugged it off, put me to bed, and went back downstairs. But as I lay there listening to the rain, I had this creeping feeling. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I know I was jolted awake by Josh. He was standing over me with a flashlight under his face, casting eerie shadows, his expression twisted with fear, not mischief. He was crying. "Something's in my room," he whispered, voice shaking. "It's hiding in my mattress. I can feel it like tentacles, squeezing." It was absurd, but seeing him so terrified, I couldn't help feeling scared too. He insisted I go with him to check his room, so I led the way, him cowering behind me like the younger sibling. His door was ajar, yet when I tried to push it open, it felt like something was leaning against it. Josh's whispered, "I think it's standing there," made my skin crawl. But then the door swung open on its own. His room was a wreck. The mattress was torn open, its stuffing scattered around like fresh snow. Fluff floated in the air, as if something had clawed its way out from inside. "It's out," Josh breathed. I bolted back to my room, slamming the door and barricading it with a chair. I could hear Josh pounding on the other side, his cries turning to jumbled, unintelligible gibberish that didn't sound like him at all. I waited, frozen, expecting Teresa to come investigate, but she never did. Finally, the noise stopped, and I heard Josh retreat down the hall, his footsteps fading back to his room. Then, with a chilling sense of realization, I remembered that our windows overlooked a low roof we used to sneak between rooms. Just as that thought crossed my mind, I saw Josh's face in my window, drenched in rain. A manic, terrified grin stretched across his face. Panicking, I yanked the chair away from the door, dashed downstairs, and found Teresa, outside, in her car with a guy, completely oblivious. I pounded on the window until she saw me, her look of annoyance vanishing the moment she registered my face. I dragged her back into the house, now a war zone. Walls were torn apart, wires and drywall scattered as if something had clawed its way through every room. "Where's Josh?" she demanded, wide-eyed, her voice breaking with fear. "He's in the basement," I said, though I hadn't seen him, but I knew that was where he had gone. We grabbed a flashlight and approached the basement door. Teresa called out, but all that answered was more of Josh's eerie, distorted mumbling. It was nonsense, like English, but twisted. "What's he saying?" she asked. I had no idea. Teresa gripped my shoulder, shut the basement door, and slid a dresser in front of it. She grabbed the phone and dialed my parents, who were already on their way home. She told me to wait in my room while she kept watch over the basement. I took a deep breath and climbed the stairs. The hallway was worse than before. More walls broken, as if something had ripped outwards from each one. When I passed Josh's room, I heard the soft sound of shuffling. I ran to my own room, heart racing. I shut the door, only to realize the handle was gone. My panic rising, I heard the same garbled, gibberish whispering. Then Josh stepped out of the shadows. His face was contorted in a horrified grin, his mouth stretched too wide. He whispered words that were strangely familiar. Play, play, he chanted louder and louder. It sounded like gibberish until I realized it was backward. I whispered, "Help me!" And as I said it aloud, thunder crashed. Josh's grin vanished as he fell back into the shadows. Downstairs, I heard my parents' voices calling out. I ran to them, and they stared in shock at the state of the house. My mom's relief at seeing me vanished when she realized Josh was missing. My dad pushed the dresser aside, opened the basement door, and called for Josh. When no answer came, he descended with a flashlight. I heard my mom scream from below, and I ran to the basement. My dad was cradling Josh, who was curled up behind the furnace, his skin marred with burns. He mumbled, his voice clearer now but still garbled, as if he couldn't stop speaking backward. The doctors chalked it up to a stress-induced breakdown. They said the burns were from him pressing against the furnace, and that his backward speech was a symptom of trauma. But I knew that wasn't the whole truth. I remember Josh's back, covered with strange, intricate burns, symbols too precise for him to have done to himself. It was raining cats and dogs, and I was still miles from home. The business meeting had dragged on far too long, and I was left driving back alone, on a highway slicked with rain. Night driving had always been difficult for me. My eyesight seemed to struggle after sunset, and with the downpour that night, it was nearly impossible to see the road. Thankfully, the highway was nearly empty, the occasional car passing by every few minutes, headlights barely cutting through the mist. I usually avoided driving at night, but tonight I had no choice. Raindrops pelted the windshield as milestones blurred by. My thoughts wandered to the warmth of home and a much-needed glass of scotch. That's when I saw it. A silhouette standing on the roadside, barely visible through the downpour. Slowing down, the figure became clearer. It was a man, holding a large umbrella over his head, one arm outstretched, thumb up in a plea for a lift. Apprehensive, I debated if I should stop. He could be anyone after all. But as I approached, something made me stop. I rolled down the window and the man leaned in, the umbrella sheltering his head. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," he said in a gravelly voice. "My car broke down, and I can't get a mechanic out here in this weather. Could you give me a lift home? It's not far." I looked at him, a tall, well-dressed man, his suit completely drenched. With a slight hesitation, I replied, "Of course, get in." Once seated, he extended a hand. "I'm Suresh. Thanks for stopping. I've been out here for almost half an hour and no one else bothered." "Can't blame them," I said, taking his cold hand in mine. "There's just too much caution these days. I'm Abhishek, by the way." Suresh smiled faintly, and as the rain intensified, I started the car and continued down the road. The storm was relentless, making the drive more treacherous by the minute. As I struggled with the visibility, Suresh glanced at me, concerned. "Are you sure you'll be able to drive safely in this?" he asked. "I have to. Important meeting tomorrow morning," I replied, though I could feel the tires slipping on the wet road. He raised an eyebrow, hesitated, and then said, "Why don't you stay the night at my place and leave first thing?" "It's safer." I mulled it over. The rain was getting worse, and my grip on the wheel felt uneasy. "All right," I conceded. "Probably for the best." The next 20 minutes were uneventful as I followed his directions down smaller roads until we came upon a sign reading Nagar Haveli. The mansion was massive, a structure from another era with golden domes and white walls glowing against the stormy sky. It was closer to a palace than a home, and I was taken aback. The gates opened as Suresh entered a code, and I drove slowly through the cobblestone path lined with pristine topiaries and well-kept gardens. I wondered how one man could live in a place like this alone. Suresh led me to a vast living room adorned with claret armchairs and a sprawling white couch, all facing a grand mahogany table near a marble fireplace. I was in awe of the opulence, trying to process every detail. Suresh excused himself, leaving me to settle in, and returned shortly, now dressed in a night robe. "Would you like some scotch?" he asked, and I gratefully accepted. We talked about work, life, and his family history while sipping the aged liquor. Suresh seemed content, but had a haunted look when he spoke of his family's past. When I asked, he sighed, mentioning his great-grandfather, a wealthy landowner with a dark side, known for his cruelty and violent temper. One day, he went too far, Suresh explained. He beat a man to death for stealing grain. Days later, that man's accomplices returned to the mansion, looted it, and murdered my great-grandfather. No one ever found his body. "Sounds like a ghost story," I joked. He looked at me, dead serious. "In this house, we don't joke about such things." After a strained silence, we finished our drinks and headed upstairs. He led me to a guest room, a lavish space with a king-size bed and heavy drapes. Just as he was about to leave, he paused. "Whatever happens, don't leave your room tonight. Strange things happen around here sometimes." His tone was ominous. I brushed it off, chalking it up to superstition, and settled into bed. But around 3 a.m., I woke to loud, insistent knocking on the door. Disoriented, I called out, "I'm coming!" and groggily approached the door. As I opened it, the hallway was empty, the stillness pierced only by the relentless rain outside. A chill swept over me, a cold so intense I could feel it down to my bones. I closed the door, feeling a presence behind me, but there was nothing there. A few moments later, the knocking resumed, louder, more desperate. I backed up, heart pounding, then remembered Suresh's words. "Don't leave your room." Against my better judgment, I stepped outside. The hall was pitch dark, and my phone's flashlight barely pierced the shadows. Suresh's room was just down the hall, and his door was wide open. I entered cautiously, only to find the bed empty, sheets tossed aside as if he had left in a hurry. Downstairs, the front door stood ajar. I approached, peering out into the storm, where flashes of lightning lit up the porch. And there he was, standing near a freshly dug hole in the garden, shovel in hand, rain pouring over his face. "Suresh!" I called out, but he barely turned. When he did, his expression was distant, almost possessed. "You shouldn't have stopped for me," he whispered. "What are you talking about?" I took a step closer, but his gaze shifted. He looked at me with hollow eyes. "You don't understand my great-grandfather's curse," he murmured, his voice dark and strained. "I have his blood, his temper, his madness." Before I could react, he lunged, but his form passed right through me, as if he were nothing but air. A tremor ran through my spine, my fear turning to horror as I realized he wasn't alive. Slowly, Suresh faded back into the rain, vanishing as lightning cracked across the sky. I've always been terrified of thunderstorms ever since my parents took me to a reenactment of one of the worst tornadoes in history when I was young. I got it in my head that every thunderstorm would bring a huge tornado, so I'm lucky to live in an area that rarely sees big storms. One day, my brother and I convinced our dad to take us to see World War Z at the movies. We were both too young to see it on our own, but luckily, we didn't miss out. Just before we left, I noticed the sky was darker than I'd ever seen it, but I was too excited about the movie to worry much. The film was intense, and my heart was already pounding by the time we got to the plane crash scene near the end. I was practically sinking down into my seat a scared kid gripping the armrest, when suddenly the screen went dark. For a second, I thought it was just the projector. But then the emergency lights flickered on, and theater staff came in to tell us we'd lost power and needed to take shelter in the main lobby. I hadn't even noticed the storm outside, but as we entered the lobby, I could barely see anything beyond the doors, just a thick gray curtain of rain. Every few seconds, lightning flashed, lighting up only a few feet ahead. The wind was so strong that everything left outside was bent at an angle. That was one of the only times I remember hearing the wind howl that loud. My brother and dad weren't as freaked out as I was, which somehow made me feel even more anxious, like I was the only one truly aware of how bad things could get. I must have been visibly scared, because Dad offered to run out and grab the car to pick us up. That snapped me out of my frozen state, and he was already headed out into the rain. My brother and I waited for what felt like forever, just watching for our car's headlights to pull up. I couldn't really tell how my brother was feeling, but he seemed calm, standing quietly beside me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw our car, and we ran out. Even though it was just a few steps, the rain drenched us instantly. Once inside, Dad asked if we were okay. We both said yes, but didn't say much else. I was just trying to breathe, tune everything out, and calm down. The drive home wasn't any better. My brother started taunting me, saying things like, "Look outside, it's not that bad," or "Why are you so scared?" At one point, he even rolled down my window, letting the rain spray in, which scared me even more. Eventually, Dad told him to knock it off. I glanced outside occasionally, seeing massive puddles that looked like they could swallow a car, headlights flashing as cars crawled along, and trees and power lines shaking in the wind. Eventually, I just stared down at my feet, trying to block everything out. All I could hear was rain hammering the car, and the windshield wipers moving as fast as they could. By the time we got home, 25 minutes had passed for what should have been a 10-minute drive. The storm had started to clear, but our neighborhood was a mess. One of our neighbors had 3 massive trees in their front yard, and one had fallen, completely blocking the road. Another neighbor was out with a chainsaw, cutting it up so people could get through. I went straight to my room, curled up in bed with my stuffed animals, still shaking, but grateful we'd made it home safely without getting caught in a tornado.